I don't think Richard Sharp is remotely corrupt. I think that Richard Sharp is a decent human being who is trying to do a good job. And like many people who's joined the BBC, he's become very fond of the organisation which he now heads.
The appointment of Richard Sharp as BBC chairman. The Sunday Times reported that shortly before being given the job, Mr Sharp helped the then Prime Minister secure a loan guarantee agreement worth £800,000. He says he simply connected people, but has asked the BBC board to review his appointment. Joining us now is Professor Tim Luckhurst, the former BBC executive and now principal of South College, Durham. Morning, Tim.
Good morning.
Where's the smell in this as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think the smell is that this is a prime ministerial appointment, an appointment made on the whim of the person who occupies number 10 Downing Street. Now, that's certainly the case, and Boris Johnson certainly knew and was happy to appoint a friend in the form of Richard Sharp to the job. Does that mean Richard Sharp's not suitable for the job? No, it doesn't. Does it mean he's been appointed in a different way from any other chairman of the BBC? No, it certainly doesn't. Margaret Thatcher appointed Marmaduke Hussey, who was a good friend of hers. Clement Attlee appointed Lord Simon, who was the founder of the New Statesman, and Attlee had recently made him a Labour peer. So there's a problem with the nature of the job. I'm not sure that there's actually a problem with the individuals, although you can ask a very serious question. Does Richard Sharp know very much about broadcasting? No, he's got a great experience in business, but he hasn't got a background in news or broadcasting at all.
But, I mean, let's be honest here, we should be very clear. The BBC, in the end, would have wanted someone close to government. I mean, the job of the BBC chairman is to stop the BBC being stripped by government. It's to protect the deals in the charter. It's probably to protect the licence fee. Let's be honest. That's the funding of the BBC is at stake. And I imagine that all parties want coziness here. They want someone cozying up to the government, and the government wants someone to cozy up to them from the BBC. This is how the establishment works, isn't it?
Well, that's a slightly sceptical view, but not an unfair one, Steve. You're absolutely right, and Richard Sharp has been doing a formidable job of defending the licence fee and indeed the corporation. I was at a briefing with him last week, virtually in my case, but he was giving a briefing in London where Richard Sharp made a very passionate defence of the BBC World Service and called for direct government funding of the BBC World Service because he said the licence fee was no longer sufficient to fund this very important part of British cultural diplomacy. So you're right. Yes, of course, prime ministers, cabinets want at the top of the corporation someone who will represent them, and the corporation wants at the top of the BBC someone who will have a good relationship with the government. But I think we should also note that the board of governors at the BBC is slightly less important than it used to be. Yeah. Ofcom now regulates the BBC. The chairman of the board used to really be at the top of the organisation regulating the corporation. He isn't anymore. That job has gone to Ofcom, which regulates broadcasting throughout, whether it's independent or BBC broadcasting.
And of course, Boris Johnson wanted to appoint one of his chums into that as well. But again, I'm not saying it critical. I mean, if you win an election, maybe this is what you get. One of the prizes of winning an election is you get to pick people in positions of authority. He wanted, it's Michael Grade now, isn't the chairman of Ofcom, but he wanted Paul Dacre for a while. If you elect a
Conservative
Conservative
government, very good
government,
appointment, by the way.
Paul Dacre.
I think so, yeah.
But if you elect a Conservative government, there's probably Conservative appointments in public life, perhaps.
I think that the issue really is the big one. It's about the nature of public appointments. You were talking earlier, Stig, on the programme about the difference between issues and individuals. And we tend to like to focus on individuals. Journalists always have, and I'm a former journalist, and I understand exactly why that is. Our readers want to read about individuals. But the issues are actually the really important thing. It is much more important to ask ourselves, do we want public appointments made in this way? Should there be a much more independent, much less partisan mechanism for making such appointments? And then your response would probably be, well, politicians wouldn't want to have such appointments if that were the case. Well, that's the debate we should really be having. I don't think Richard Sharp is remotely corrupt. I think that Richard Sharp is a decent human being who is trying to do a good job. And like many people who's joined the BBC, he's become very fond of the organisation which he now heads.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But that being said, he was involved in a negotiation about money. He did work with, he was a mentor.
Well, I don't think he was involved in a negotiation about money. I think he's been very clear about that. I think he was approached by somebody he knew who wanted to help someone to whom he was distantly related, Boris Johnson, and that Richard Sharp made the connection between two individuals. Now, that's, I think, perhaps the way the world works. But I think that the suggestion that Richard Sharp was actually involved in negotiating the loan is probably not the case, although the Commissioner for Public Appointments will look very closely at that.
And I guess the question, Tim, is that's a fair distinction. But the point is, none of this would be an issue if there was a very clear, straightforward, impartial appointments process. Because
I agree with you,
yeah.
and I think that we should have clear, straightforward appointments processes. I think that that would be a good reform to public life, but I think it would also change the nature of appointments that governments would wish to make, because they would see a disadvantage in having entirely independent people rather than people with whom they have amicable relations. It's perhaps one of the rather old-fashioned natures of British public life, and it probably does need to be reformed. But again, that's about systems. It's not about individuals. It's about doing something which is genuinely transparent, genuinely open, and which the public can really trust. I think we'd all be in favour of that.
Yeah, and if we have this conversation in 10 years' time, Tim, would we be talking about a BBC which didn't have the licence fee, do you think? Is that sort of seismic change happening?
I think that question is more alive than it has been for a very long time. In the end, I think that any British government is going to conclude, as Richard Sharp argued last week, in fact, that the BBC is very valuable as a tool of British cultural diplomacy. The broadcasting arena has changed spectacularly. For example, there is now a station called Times Radio which offers genuinely intelligent competition to BBC Speech Radio and is doing extraordinarily well. I'm delighted to see that. But I think a licence fee will survive. I think it will be smaller, and the really big question must be, what should the BBC do? What doesn't it need to do? What can privately funded subscription services do that the BBC used to do and actually do better? And the answer to that is the BBC is going to be smaller, but I think it's still a very valuable British institution, and I think it needs universal funding, perhaps funded on the basis of the ability to pay rather than a flat fee.
Really interesting stuff, and bless your heart for saying that about Times Radio. Tim, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Tim Luckhurst there, Professor Tim Luckhurst, former BBC executive and now Principal of South College, Durham.